Pennsylvania, Scranton, Pennsylvania, home of the office. My mother actually was born and raised in Israel. My mother was born in Haifa, Israel, and she moved to America against her will at 11 years old. The orphanage literally sent my mother to America to live with her adopted mother, and that's a story I'll tell real quick. My mom was born in January of 1948, just a few months before Israel was reborn. And she was given up for adoption not too long after. And first of all, hey, when I went to my cousin Veer is here with his wife Carolina in the back there. Veer, will you wave up there? You must have known his name. And his wife and her brother and sister-in-law and his beautiful baby Sean, welcome. And so this is part of his story too. He's actually coming here from Israel. He grew up in north of Haifa, and he moved to America. And he's actually here in Houston, so you guys can harass him whenever you see him around town. He's here in Houston, and he does a great job of putting in garage doors. Actually, he's a businessman. He does many things, but it's one of the things he does as a business of his.
Cool.
So my mother and his grandfather, Micha, were both given up for adoption in Israel in 1948, right around when Israel became a modern state. As a matter of fact, they were one of the first adoptions in the modern state of Israel because they were adopted right after Israel became a state and was reborn. And my mother was adopted into a separate family. So Micha, Dvir's grandfather, my uncle, was separated from my mom in 1948 into two different families. He was into a secular kibbutz family, where Dvir grew up, and his mom raised him, and dad raised him there. And my mother was adopted to a different family, into a Orthodox religious couple's home. They didn't have any kids. They adopted my mom as their only child. My mother never knew she was adopted. They never told her. She thought that was, at least as a child, she never knew. She thought those were her real parents. And Micha grew up in a kibbutz life. Kibbutz is like a communal way of living. It's kind of the heartbeat of Israel, why Israel is alive today. It's because little communities pulled together to help survive. They built walls. Somebody protected the walls. Somebody watched the kids. Somebody planted in the fields. That's kind of the heartbeat of how Israel was reborn. And my mother was in this Orthodox couple's home. And when my mom was 6, who she thought was her real father had died. His name was Peretz Miller. He was in Haifa. He owned a small factory in Haifa, cutting marble for tombstones and for kitchens and stuff like that. But he died when my mom was only 6 years old. And my adopted grandmother, Batya Miller, her maiden name was Schweitzer, she decides she can't raise my mom. She had a really difficult life, if you can imagine. Israel's young. She survived fleeing the Holocaust. She lost her parents, her brother Elimelech Schweitzer, and my grandmother had really very few blood relatives because of the Holocaust, but she made it. Her grandfather gave her a kiss, I'll see you in the promised land, and he didn't make it. Just about none of her family made it. But she did, and she couldn't have children. She ended up adopting my mother, so I give the backstory of my adopted grandmother. We found out later my real grandmother, similar story, her name was Ruth Epstein. She also fled the Holocaust, made it to Israel. And turns out she was either forced to, but she was a single mother, couldn't raise these two children, so she gave them up for adoption. So let's go back to my adopted grandmother. That's the stories I know the most. But my adopted grandmother, when her husband died, she decides, just like my mom's real mother, she can't raise this child as a single mother, so she puts my mother back in the orphanage in Haifa, northern Israel, for 5 years. And then one day at 10 or 11 years old, my mother gets a message from one of the workers, "Hey, Hannah, we have good news for you. You're going to America." So they ship my mother on a plane by herself, one of those escort, you ask the stewardess to keep an eye on her kind of thing. And my mother moved to the other promised land of the Jewish people, New York City, of course. And she ended up one summer, on a warm summer's evening, she met my father at a Jewish summer camp. My father was a Gentile. At a Jewish summer camp, just working that summer as a side job. And my Orthodox grandmother, who was raising my mother, and who my mother still didn't know she was adopted, was pretty mad that my mother fell in love with a Gentile at a Jewish summer camp.
Wow.
And it wasn't too long after that my grandmother was so mad, that's when my mom found out she was adopted pretty much.
Wow.
So if you understand, there's just one, in Judaism, there's one thing you don't do. You don't become a Christian or marry one. That's what they were taught. And I don't agree with that, but that's what they were taught. Because there were some bad Christians in history that did some really bad things to Jewish people. And I wouldn't say Christianity, but there was pieces of history that have never been forgotten in the Jewish community, particularly crusaders with the cross and a sword. Our people have never forgotten, my grandmother had never forgotten. But she learned to love my dad, and she learned to love her little half-Jewish grandkids. And I was so grateful growing up that she reminded me all the time about, don't you forget, your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, don't you forget. And she'd smash the kippah on my head, the yarmulke, every Shabbat. And she'd come over. My father was a little intimidated by that side of his children, so we were a little close back. No. But every time I see my grandmother on Shabbat, we'd be reminded. I'm just so grateful. Because now I believe in a rabbi, the greatest rabbi that ever lived.
Hallelujah. Come on.
And my son Max, we came to the States this summer, and after 6.5 years, I finally found a small little cottage in Pennsylvania because we come in every summer. And there's 7 of us, and I've just been praying, I want something that I can have that's our own. We can have our own family traditions. We don't have to kind of meld it with whatever family accepts us that summer, whatever of our family. So we found a cottage this summer. It was amazing. But we were planning Max's bar mitzvah in America because we were in that summer. Israel's restrictions were pretty hefty, and I scheduled this Reform rabbi, and we had a meeting. We talked about a Reform synagogue. There's 3 forms of Judaism. I don't know if you've heard of it. The main forms: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. So there's a joke about that. I don't know if you heard the joke. Orthodox say God's name Adonai, Conservatives say Adonai, and Reform say
I don't know.
Kind of describes different levels of Jews. And of course, Messianic Judaism is one of the oldest forms of Judaism because our rabbi goes back 2,000 years.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
So just before we had a meeting with the rabbi, he's like, hey, he called me up and he's like, hey, I just have one question. I'm sorry to be so upfront and direct. He said, but in Israel, would you consider yourself a Messianic Jew? And I'm like, yes, I would. He's like, well, that's going to be a problem. And you have to understand, Reform, anything goes. You can be a lesbian, you can be anything. You can be a rabbi in Reform. Like, you don't have to even believe in the Bible, which is kind of typical. But they had this beautiful synagogue. I thought, well, Reform will let us in. And he's like, I'm sorry, we can't. And I'm like, he's like, listen, we don't do Christian ceremonies. I said, well, we don't want a Christian ceremony. Jesus was Jewish. It's like this awkward pause, I'll get back to you. And he texted me. We broke up over text. But we had an amazing bar mitzvah for Max, and for me, it's been always straddling this chasm of, between the two worlds, and I really feel
I won't ever break up with
there's going to come a time, and I think there is coming a time in the history of the world where people are going to understand the commonality that we have between us. And before amen.